In 1906, one letter went out from one of the most powerful offices in America. It did not announce a war. It did not move money where anyone could see it. It spoke about something that sounds almost gentle, the improvement of rural schools. And in the years that followed, the American school, the one your great-grandparents would have recognized, quietly became something else. The desks were bolted into rows. The day was cut into bells. The teacher stopped answering to the town and started answering to a system. And what a child was for, what a child was meant to become, was decided in offices those children would never see. This is the story of that letter. Who funded it? What it actually asked for in its own words. And the question almost no one is ever taught to ask. What were American schools like before someone with a fortune decided they needed redesigning? Because here is the part that stops people cold. Before this letter, America was not a backward, unlettered country waiting to be rescued. By many accounts of the period, literacy in parts of this nation ran as high or higher than it does today. It was taught in one-room schoolhouses, run by the towns themselves, answerable to no committee, no foundation, no distant board, only to the parents living down the road. So, if the schools were already working, if ordinary farmers could read scripture, argue law, and follow an argument in a newspaper that would exhaust a modern reader, then why did some of the wealthiest men in the history of the world suddenly take such a personal, organized, well-funded interest in changing them? And why did they write down, in their own documents, in plain language, exactly what they wanted the new schools to produce? We will get to those words. And I'll warn you now, once you have read them, you cannot unread them. If you have ever stood in front of an old school building, one of the good ones, with the carved stone and the high windows, and felt that it was built with more care and more seriousness than anything we put up today, then you already feel where this is going. Subscribe and stay with me, because the document at the center of this story is not a theory and not a rumor. It is real, it is public, and you can read it yourself tonight. We open one of these every week. So let's begin where the official story never does, with the world before. Picture the American school of the 1800s. Not a campus, not a district, not a system. A single room very often built by the community's own hands, with lumber the families cut and nails the families paid for. One teacher, every age in that one room. The older children helping to teach the younger, learning twice by teaching once. There was no standardized test, no federal curriculum, no bell slicing the day into 40-minute pieces, no permanent record following a child from grade to grade. A student learned to read, to write a clear hand, to reason, to argue, to do the real work of the place they actually lived. And the strange thing, the thing the official histories rush past in a single sentence, is how well it seems to have worked. Foreign travelers wrote, with something like astonishment, about ordinary American farmers and tradesmen who could quote scripture from memory, debate the law, and hold an opinion on politics that was actually their own. The newspapers of the time tell the same story without meaning to. Look at a page from the 1850s. The tiny type, the enormous paragraphs, the long and demanding sentences. That was written for ordinary people. It assumed a reader who could follow a complicated argument all the way to its end without a single picture to help them. That is the country we are told was failing. That is the country we are told needed to be fixed. And by the turn of the century, the men with the means to fix it had arrived. Two of the largest private fortunes in human history, the Rockefeller fortune, built on oil, and the Carnegie fortune, built on steel, turned their attention away from oil and steel and toward something far less obvious, toward the schoolhouse. And here is a fact you can check for yourself, because it is sitting in the open record. In those early years of the 20th century, these private foundations were spending more money on shaping American schooling than the government of the United States was. Not building railroads, not buying out competitors, not cornering a market. Schools, the quiet, unglamorous business of deciding what millions of children would learn and how, and to what end. Men who had spent their entire lives studying how to organize, how to standardize, how to remove waste and friction from enormous systems. Those men looked at the messy, local, independent American schoolhouse, and they saw a system waiting to be built. The question that opens everything else is simply this: why? Why does a man who has already won, who has more money than nations, spend the last decades of his life reorganizing the education of other people, children? The instrument they built had a name. It was called the General Education Board. It was chartered in the first years of the century, funded with Rockefeller money, and run by men who thought in systems and spreadsheets rather than in classrooms and children. And the man at the center of it, Rockefeller's closest advisor on these matters, was not a teacher either. He was a former clergyman turned organizer, a man whose entire gift was for taking a sprawling, sentimental, inefficient enterprise and turning it into a machine. And like any well-run machine, the board wrote things down. It published its intentions. It produced reports and letters and internal papers, the kind of documents that were never really meant to be read at a farmer's kitchen table. And in one of those early papers, the new education was described, its purpose laid out in language so plain that it has shocked everyone who has stumbled onto it ever since. Now, I am not going to tell you what to think about it. I am going to read you part of what the document actually says, in its own words. And then I am going to let you sit with it in the quiet for a moment. It speaks of a dream in which, and I am quoting the document's own language now, the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. Sit with that phrase, perfect docility, molding hands. And it goes further. It says plainly, without apology, that the goal is not to raise up philosophers, not men of science, not poets, not artists, not even, it says, lawyers and preachers and statesmen, of whom, in the document's own assessment, there is already an ample supply. The task it sets for itself is described as simpler than that and stranger than that: to take the people as they are found and to train them to a perfectly ideal life, just exactly where they are. Read that twice. The stated aim was not to lift a child as high as that child's mind could possibly climb. It was to fit the child, comfortably, contentedly, to a place that had already been chosen for them by someone else. And I want to be fair, because this matters. You can find this document. It is not locked in a vault. It is not a forgery passed around on the internet. It has been reprinted, cited, footnoted, and argued over by serious historians for the better part of a century. Which raises perhaps the strangest question in this entire story. How does a sentence like perfect docility to our molding hands, written about the redesign of a nation's schools, by the people paying for that redesign, survive in the open historical record for over 100 years, and almost no one who passes through those schools is ever taught that it exists? And it was not only Rockefeller. In that very same year, 1906, the great steel fortune was busy with a quieter, more technical kind of redesign. The Carnegie philanthropies introduced a new way of measuring education itself. A standard unit of classroom time, a fixed block of hours, that could be counted, compared, and stamped as official from one end of the country to the other. It sounds harmless. It sounds like bookkeeping. But think about what it really did. From that point forward, learning was no longer measured by whether you understood something. It was measured by how many hours you had sat in a chair while someone talked. Knowledge became time served. The student became a unit, and the unit could be processed. That single accounting decision, made around 1906, still governs the school your children sit in today. The credit hour, the fixed period, the bell that ends the lesson whether or not the lesson is finished. A nation of independent schoolhouses was being quietly fitted with the same gauge, the same clock, the same definition of what counted and what didn't. And none of this came from nowhere. The blueprint already existed, and it had been admired and imported decades earlier from Prussia. The Prussian state had built something the American reformers found irresistible: a system of compulsory, state-directed schooling, organized into graded ranks, ringing with bells, designed above all to produce orderly, obedient, useful subjects who would do as they were told. American reformers traveled there, studied it, and came home praising it. The age-graded classroom, the standardized curriculum, the compulsory attendance law that turned schooling from a choice the family made into a duty the state enforced. State by state, those compulsory laws spread across America, until attending the new kind of school was no longer something a town offered, but something the government required. The one-room schoolhouse, run by the people who used it, was not outlawed in a single dramatic stroke. It was simply consolidated, defunded, absorbed, and forgotten, replaced by something larger, more uniform, and answerable to someone far away. So watch what the school actually became in the decades that followed, and judge for yourself whether it matches the words written by the men who funded it. The single mixed room became a graded line. Children sorted by age, the way products are sorted by date. Each moved along to the next station, whether they were ready or not. The natural rhythm of the day became a series of bells. Start, stop, line up, sit down, move on. Not the rhythm of a farm or a workshop or a home, the rhythm of a factory floor. The lesson became a fixed unit of time, ended by a bell rather than by understanding. The curriculum became standard. The same words, the same hours, the same approved answers, from one coast to the other. And the teacher, who had once answered to the parents in her own town, now answered upward, to a district, to a board, to a system. The local schoolhouse, built by a community and accountable to that community, became a single node in a vast machine accountable to almost no one a parent could ever name. Now, the official story has an answer for all of this, and you deserve to hear it fairly, because serious and honest people make it. The answer is progress. A growing, industrializing nation of millions, absorbing wave after wave of new arrivals, simply needed schooling on a scale the old one-room model could never provide. Standardization, they say, was nothing more sinister than efficiency. The same reasonable impulse that gave us the assembly line, the public library, and clean water. And maybe that is all it was. That is a genuine argument, and you should weigh it honestly. But then hold it up against the words. Not philosophers, not scientists, not poets. Perfect docility. Train them just where they are. And ask yourself honestly whether the word efficiency really covers a sentence like that. Ask yourself whether a system designed to produce free, questioning, dangerous minds would look anything at all like the system we actually got. The bells, the rows, the tests, the permanent record, the long, quiet training in sitting still and waiting to be told. What does it change about your own years in a classroom? If the blueprint for those years was drawn, in part, by men who wrote in their own letters that they were not trying to make thinkers at all. And this is the part that connects to everything else we have traced on this channel. Over and over, inside a single narrow window of history, an older way of doing things was quietly replaced by something more uniform, more managed, and far more forgettable. The older architecture, built with impossible care, was called impractical and pulled down. The older infrastructure was sealed up and renamed. The older, freer ways of living and knowing were called disorderly, inefficient, primitive, and they were swept away in a single generation with barely a record of what was lost. The schoolhouse fits that pattern exactly. A decentralized world that taught people, above all, to think for themselves, replaced, in the space of a lifetime, by a centralized system that the very people who funded it described, in their own writing, as a pair of molding hands. Because in the end, it comes down to one difference, and it is the difference that matters most. A free mind asks the question. A trained one simply fills in the answer it was given. Which one were the new schools built to produce? I am not going to answer that for you. To answer it for you would rather miss the entire point of the story. So here is where I leave it. The letter is real. The board was real. The fortunes were real. And so was the quiet, deliberate, well-documented work of redesigning what a nation's children would become. The words, perfect docility, not philosophers, train them just where they are real. And they are waiting for you in the open record tonight. If you want to read them with your own eyes, what you decide they mean is the one thing no board, in 1906 or any year since, could ever truly decide for you. That, at least, They did not manage to standardize. If this is the kind of history you have been looking for, the kind filed under progress when it may belong under something else entirely, then subscribe and turn on the bell. We open one of these every single week, and if you want the whole pattern in one place, the system, the older world it replaced, and how to recognize the traces of it still standing in your own town, it is all waiting in the complete archive, linked in the description and pinned in the comments below. But before you go, I want you to do one thing for me. Think back to the school you actually sat in as a child, the bells, the rows, the tests, the waiting. And tell me honestly in the comments, was it built to teach you to think, or was it built to teach you to sit still? Think about which one it really was. And then think about who decided.